Okay, well, I'm going to start off our Future World of Work panel. Welcome everybody and all the participants. There'll be people joining us, so I'll just take my time introducing myself and the panel members. We're hosting this panel as part of our annual delegate conference week and hoping to continue the discussion and start the more detailed discussion on the future world of work and how that is going to affect members in the civil service, but also the wider economy. We've also conducted a survey of our members, so that's a really important strand for us in terms of looking at how you are feeling as members and what the way forward is for us. We want to have it as a very informal process as much as we can in a virtual environment, and we've got 3 panelists who we've asked to join us, who we're very grateful and appreciative for them taking the time out to talk to us as well today from their perspectives around the future world of work. Without further ado, I'll ask each of you in turn to introduce yourselves. So firstly, Peter.
Sorry, just unmuting myself, always one of these challenges with this technology. But anyway, good afternoon, delighted to be with you. Peter Cheese, I'm the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, the CIPD, which is the professional body for HR and people development. So I'll be bringing some of those perspectives to this conversation.
Thank you, great to see you, Peter. And Alice?
Hello there, and really nice to be with you this afternoon. I'm Alice Hurrell. I'm the HR Director for BEIS. So Lucille was practicing this earlier, but it's the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Much easier to say BEIS, I think. But I'm also the SRA for our Future Workplace programme, and really pleased to be here to sort of talk through some ideas about how we really get the workplace working for people, which is one of the primary aims that we've got certainly in BEIS. But really good to see you all. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Alison. Nice to see you again. And Kyle.
Yes, hi everyone. Great to be here as well. Thank you for having me. I'm a development director with a company called Leesman. We measure employee workplace experience through various survey tools that we provide to public and private sector organizations, and did a few surveys with the civil service employees over the last 12 months, including home working. So maybe some of you guys have heard of us through taking our survey. So I'll bring some of the stats and information we have around workplace as well.
Great, I'm sure it will be very interesting to hear all those different perspectives. And then last but not least, we've got Victoria. If you could introduce yourself, and then I'll head us off into the full debate.
Perfect, thanks Lucille. Yeah, I'm Victoria Jones. I'm a national officer with the FDA, and I'm working with Lucille on our Future World of Work project. So members will have heard from me asking you to fill out our survey, and in a little minute I'll be running through the findings and hopefully starting the conversation with that.
Excellent, thank you. So as I say, do put questions in the Q&A slot if you've got anything that you want to put to the panelists or the FDA itself, and we will start that debate once Victoria has done her summary of the slides in terms of the outcomes of our survey. I mean, I think the FDA is in that sphere of thinking maybe this is the time to really take an opportunity to rethink the way of work and the balance of that. And over the years, the balance between the employer and the employee, and what that means is it's governed by policy, it's governed by direction. And so how can we start to work within a new regime of working, which is built on trust, and we develop that trust as we go forward. So I think if I can ask Victoria to go through the slides first, and then I'll go to the panelists for their initial thoughts on that, and then take it from there. Thank you.
Perfect. This is the bit where I hope I don't break the technology, and hopefully you can all see my slides. Lucille, can you give me a nod if you can see them?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect, thank you ever so much. So yeah, as Lucille mentioned, I'm going to run through the data, so I will be the Chris Whitty of this session, but I can control my own slides, which is good. We will be talking a little bit about the survey that we did last month, over the last couple of months, but I wanted to first mention we do an annual working hour survey of our members, which is a good way of us checking, you know, how things are going on the ground, how many excess hours people are working, but we also ask questions around the pandemic and about how you'd adapted. We found out there from the working hour survey that 97% of members wanted to continue some form of working from home. We weren't sure what that looked like, but 97% of people told us they'd like to continue working from home in some format. We decided when we started looking at the Future World of Work project that we wanted to go into that in a bit more detail. So we did our survey, as I said, about 1,500 responses, so a really good response. We've got lots of interesting data to really dig into, and I've got the highlights for you here, but we do know that we want to look at this from different demographics, and also look at different departments. We'll hear from Alice in a bit about the BEIS way of working with this, but we know from our members who are in Ofsted or who are in roles where you're required to attend a physical workspace more often, that the requirements will be slightly different. So we're going to have a look at that data in more detail. We've also got, and this is a challenge, I think Kai will probably agree, but to anyone who asks any open-ended questions or free text boxes, we've got a lot of really good qualitative data as well to work our way through. So as I said, these are just the highlights for now and a bit of the headline statistics, but I think it's really interesting and a really good opportunity to get a sense of where we are now. So the survey was split into two parts. The first was looking at that question about what is it like for you at the moment working in a pandemic. And some of the findings weren't too surprising, as I'm sure you'll agree. Make sure I move out of the way. So 94% of members told us that they only worked from home no more than 2 days a week before the pandemic. And now we've got 92% of members who responded to the survey told us they are working from home almost every day. So a really significant shift there to less than 2 days a week to, yep, I am always at home in my spare room as I am now. So a common theme there that I think our panelists will agree with as well. We asked some questions about how it feels personally to be working in the way that you are at the moment. 49% said they felt more isolated at home. 45% found it more difficult to switch off. And 73% of members thought that they had found it easier to find a better work-life balance. Now, when I was looking at this, I thought maybe those last 2 points there could be kind of could not fit that well together. But I think in reality, you can find it difficult to switch off while still having a slightly better work-life balance if you're kind of using your commute more effectively or in a different way. So there's definitely detail to get into there as well. We asked how work feels at the moment and what that looks like. I was really interested in this first point. 75% of members tell us that they felt just as engaged with the priorities and objectives of their department as they had done before. I think that shows a shift in terms of the way that managers and ministers in our instance are communicating how they're interacting with staff and how that's kind of coming across. 54% of colleagues felt they can work just as effectively with colleagues. This is being facilitated by Zoom, thank goodness. So we know that, you know, the technology is out there to help us to have those conversations remotely as well. 38% of members are keen to get back to the office and make connections and network, which I thought was interesting as well. The final one I wanted to highlight from this section of the survey is about trust. Lucille mentioned it briefly already, and I'm sure we'll get into a conversation about what this looks like going forward. But before the pandemic, 69% of members agreed that they were trusted to work effectively at home, and that's risen to 92%, which I think is really significant. I think particularly for our members on both sides of the management table, this is a really interesting and important conversation about how you manage your staff, but also how you're managed. I think the conversation about trust needs to happen, and it's something that's definitely on our agenda as well. So the second part of the survey, we spoke about what's next. You know, what would you like? What's your ultimate aims if we think about the future world of work and what the potential is there? 68% of members told us they wouldn't consider relocating for work. This is really interesting for us if we think about places for growth and the government's plans for levelling up across the country. How is that going to impact on members on a one-to-one individual basis. I think that would be a really interesting point to consider. This one, I personally am really invested in the idea of flexible working, but 66% of members said they'd turn down a role if it didn't give you the option for flexible remote working. Back in 2019, we did some research with King's College into the future of flexible working, looking at the interaction between flexible working and career development. And I think those two pieces sat together are really interesting. And I think the fact that members are now telling us they prioritise those flexible working options is really, really important. Here we talked about some of the issues around what's concerning members. The first one actually I thought was quite interesting, because from our perspective, we weren't sure how concerned members would be about some of the conversations around monitoring and the use of tech to monitor what your output is. And actually 57% of members said that that's something that they're really got their eyes on. So that will help us to shape the work that we do going forward. 42% were worried that their career progression had been halted because they weren't seen in the office. I think there's something in that as well about that visibility. And 87% of members wanted their employer to consider the environmental impact of their next steps, and that's particularly around office spaces and kind of the estate strategy. 50% of people said that they strongly agreed with that. We've just launched our green network in the session before this, so there's definitely work to be done there as well. This one split us a little bit, and I think this would be interesting to get the panel views on as well. As a trade union, we're looking at what the contractual changes might look like for members in different circumstances. And one of the issues that has obviously come up is around London waiting. We asked members a very crude question: would you go into the office a set number of times a week so that you could get your London waiting allowance? 31% of members said they would, 46% said they wouldn't. So for us, that shows that, you know, our membership is not one homogenous group. There are different things that work for different people. But it'd be really interesting, I think, to have a conversation on London waiting or location allowances and what the future of that looks like. And then finally, I wanted to pick up on this one. The question we asked was, you know, do you want to have a set time that you want to be in the office? So I'm going to work in the office Monday and Tuesday. I'm going to work from home Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Or do you want the flexibility to decide when you want to kind of structure when and how you want to structure your week? 51% of members wanted that flexibility. And I think that's quite interesting if we look at some of the briefing that's coming out from government ministers. Initially, it was everyone get back into the offices, you know, support your local preps. And then we've seen a change to, you know, actually, can we talk about, you know, more remote working so that we can rationalise our estates? I think for us, that 51% is almost, you know, the epitome of actually we need some hybrid thinking, we need some flexibility. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear the panel views on that as well. We also asked our members to tell us what their priorities were, and I've just highlighted the top 4 that came out of this, and this is the work that we will be doing. We'll be taking this forward and embedding it into our work. So they talked about embedding all types of flexible working into workplaces. Again, a bit of a pet peeve for me is that difference between remote working and working in your home because there's a pandemic, and flexible working, which could be compressed hours, part-time, job shares, all of those things. So I think there's a real conversation to be had there. Protecting the right to switch off from work, and we know there's lots of good work happening around that, and we're keen to kind of see how that translates into our environment. Making the future world of work more accessible for everyone. There are some key accessibility and equality questions here that have come out from the pandemic and the way that we work. So accessibility to meetings, whether that's hosting them at the right time or making sure that you're being inclusive in terms of the people that you're inviting to the conversations and when those conversations are happening as well. And then promotion opportunities. We know about places for growth, we know about levelling up, but how do you ensure that you've got promotion opportunities for members across the country as well? The final thing I wanted to just really briefly mention is that based on this survey and our engagement with our executive committee, we've identified these 5 key areas which we think we're going to kind of structure our future world of work project on. So these are contractual rights, places for growth, which is going to have a huge impact on the civil service workforce. The cultural shift, so picking up on those trust questions and how this could really shape the way that we work going forward. Career development, it's at the heart of what we do with our FDA Learn work anyway, but we're keen to see how career development might have changed thanks to the pandemic, and the equality impact, just as I mentioned there. The key thing for us is this is just the start of the conversation. I think if we were in previous times, we would all be in a room right now, and we'd be really keen to have a conversation and have quite an informal structure where we can really hear the views from you. So I would just put another plug in for questions to the chat so we can raise them and have a really good discussion about what this looks like. But I think that's it for me, Lucille. I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Some very interesting trends and detail in there, isn't there, in terms of particularly picking up on that point around trust. So if 51% of people want to be able to determine their own hours, how does that operate in the very sort of strict or formal processes that we have currently within employers? So I'd really like to just turn to each of our panel members in turn, in terms of both anything that strikes you from those statistics, but also if you could talk to the participants around your experiences and thoughts around the future world of work and how you see it from your perspective. That'd be really fantastic. And then we'll open up for the debate. So Peter, over to you first.
Mute. There we go. Victor, thank you very much. I mean, really interesting survey, and so much of what you described really resonated. I mean, in my role, I talked to lots of different organizations across lots of sectors, obviously a lot with the HR profession, but also seen a lot of surveys along these sorts of lines, because everybody's really intrigued to say, so what will this mean? You know, coming out of what's been described as the greatest experiment in home working ever. And I think it's pointed to so many of the things that you've described, you know, these cultural questions about trust. And actually, if we're honest, you know, flexible working itself had not really changed its patterns for a very long time. And indeed, the patterns of work haven't changed for generations. You're still talking about the standard working week of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and all those sorts of things. So the pandemic acting as a real catalyst, and that's what the survey is showing, is I think it's encourage people to think differently. And also for the many people, indeed the majority, who would say, look, I'd like more flexibility in how I work and more choice in how I work. These are not entirely new findings. It's just people now feel much more able to express them, because they're saying, well, goodness, we've learned all this time through working from home that indeed we can trust people to work effectively when they're not visible. And this points to this big and long-standing cultural question of presenteeism, where people have an innate bias towards the people that they see most, and therefore also somewhat biased towards saying, well, the ones who are performing best are the ones I see the most of, because they're in the office working longer, and not so able to judge by output. And yet during this time, we've judged more by output of what people do and trust them to get on with their jobs. I mean, other which we might debate further, Victoria, like monitoring and other things like that, which people worry about. But nonetheless, I think, as I said, many of these survey findings pointing to these very profound opportunities for improving the ways in which we work, which can be good for people's well-being. You know, again, you've got counterbalancing things going on, as you saw through the survey, but very broadly, if we can create a world of work from all of this, which gives people more choice, more flexibility in hours and schedules, as well as places of work, which to allow them to better balance things like their work and their home lives and other commitments, that's got to be a good thing. And it also speaks very strongly to an incredibly important agenda, which also we need to continue to make real progress on, which is inclusion. And the many people who have not always had the opportunity to either get work or progress in work because of their less ability to access the workplace on a full-time basis. And actually, I think across the public sector, by and large, it was in a somewhat better place than many other organizations, because after all, so much of the work of the civil service doesn't require the majority of the workforce to be in places of work. So there tended to be a bit more flexible working going on. But really encouraging to see, I think, as I said, a real resonance of ideas here. And it leads to the challenge back to all of us at every level, because you know, one of the constraints we've had and seen in the past is because it comes down so much to the manager and the individual manager's ability to understand and manage people working in all these different ways. And indeed, even things like the right to request flexible working, which comes to the manager, and the manager can say no, and often they may be saying no because they don't really understand how they would best and effectively manage people if they weren't working full-time or in the place of work. So I think that's the other thing that's emerging a lot now from all of this debate, is that it is making us think much more about people front and center in our organizations. It's making us think much more, therefore, about what we've got to do to better train people managers, which after all is all of us at different levels, in managing and understanding people's different needs, how we can support them, how we listen to them. And there's so much in all of this which is very inherent, which is the idea of employee voice. But also, I just close off, Lucille, because I think it's going to be an important part of the conversation about fairness in all of this. Because whilst on the one hand, I mean, let's take a couple of obvious dimensions. One of them, of course, is we're all busily debating working from home. The fact is, across the nation, less than the workforce were able to work from home. So in other words, most of the working population is still needing to be in places of work, whether it be because they're working manufacturing sites or many of the so-called frontline and essential workers. So we've got to make sure, which is why it was good to see talking about flexible working more broadly, that we've got to see how we can balance all forms of flexible working to support all of the workforce wherever and however they work. And then we've got to make sure, as I said, on the cultural dimensions, that if people are working more from home, that they ideally have that choice, but they, as again the survey called out, are disadvantaged in the ways that frankly they have been in the past. And I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say in the past, where we had more women working part-time and flexible work hours, for many long-standing and obvious reasons, I suppose, more caring responsibilities, as an example. That was one of the reasons why they were sometimes disadvantaged in the world of work, because they weren't able to judge their performance effectively, or as well as those that might be sat in front of us. And indeed, other things like networks that go on and these sorts of cultural dynamics, which again, rightly have been called out through the survey. So as I said, I think overall, really interesting to see the work. It chimes with a lot of what I believe and what we are seeing. And I think it raises, as you did towards the end there, Victoria, some very, very important questions about what next, about fairness, about working to principles. And finally, I would also say, we're going to have to learn as we go. It was, in many ways, this is going to be harder than the original lockdown. The original lockdown was a very binary thing. We just had to do it. This has got all sorts of variables and things which have been called out through the survey, which we're going to have to work our way through.
No, very interesting that it resonates so profoundly, which I thought it would, but that's really interesting to hear. And also I was looking recently at the TUC research pre-pandemic, where 1 in 3 flexible working requests were turned down.
Yes, right.
And that comes again back to, what tools are being given. I suppose it's really good that we've got Alice up next, because, as an employer delivering on this, both in the interim, but also taking us forward. But any thoughts from you around the survey, but also more generally about future world of work, Alice?
Thanks, Lucille, and absolutely. So I think we have got an absolutely fabulous opportunity to do things very differently and to learn the lessons of what's worked well. So I remember right at the beginning of the pandemic, and you may have been involved in some of those conversations, Lucille, as well, where we talked about how on earth do we get a whole workforce who is in Bayes face towards dealing with COVID, working really effectively from home, and how do we do that quickly? How do we make sure that we don't lose any of the productivity that we've got? And we did that extremely successfully. And in fact, we had productivity surveys done by KPMG, which showed how effectively we were able to pivot to working from home. And also inclusively. So our diversity and inclusion scores in our people survey went up. Across teams, people said that they felt included in things that they hadn't previously been included in. It's given people different opportunities for development. So where you wouldn't be able to invite more junior members into a meeting, for instance, it's quite easy on Microsoft Teams or on Zoom to be able to give those opportunities. So I think that's another thing that we've definitely benefited from. I think the big trick for us is going to be how we actually start to do the blend. So when we are in a position to start more hybrid working, so part of the time in the office and part of the time from home, how we keep that inclusion going, because we have already begun to sort of talk about, we don't want a 2-tier workforce. where it's all the senior people that are in, and there is a risk of that in the civil service, because obviously we're there to serve ministers, and you know, ministers like to see people face to face. So we need to be quite careful about how we do that, and in fact adopting things like, you know, Microsoft Teams meetings by default, so every meeting would be accessible remotely as it would be in person, and then trying to get our managers and leaders to start to chair meetings inclusively and those kinds of things. But in terms of the survey, it really chimes, because we've done our own surveys and been part of the Leesman survey, and I know we're going to hear from Kyle, but some of what we've seen in your surveys also come through in ours. In other words, people do want greater flexibility. More generally, you know, people have seen, you know, a positive impact on their work-life balance from getting rid of the commute, and I think there's some things that we need to do to try and get a bit of separation back for people, which I think has been missing, but also a sense that, you know, some people do really want to be back in the office, and for quite significant parts of their time too. So really we're trying to cater to different people's needs, and trying to balance all that with the business needs, and trying to get that right, so that we can move forward in a positive way. I think the messages that we've given in Bays have definitely been around testing and learning, so we don't expect to be able to get this right straight away, and actually we're expecting a kind of phasing up when we're allowed to work back in offices again for office-based non-frontline workers, that we do that in a phased way, so that we can learn some of those lessons about what's working, what isn't working so well, and trying to put sort of different ways of working in place. The other thing that I would say is I think it's supercharged our ability to do our levelling up and location strategy as well, because in Bays in particular, our sort of core department has been very London centric. And you know, the things that have come out in the survey about people building careers outside London have been a major concern. But I think we've shown that line managers can lead across, you know, multiple locations. I mean, people are in their own homes, so you don't get much more dispersed than that. That we can absolutely learn those lessons and move forward. The other thing that I would say, I mean, whilst we've had, you know, there's a group of people that we know that are feeling quite anxious about coming back, and the change that will bring about in their personal life, and, you know, how they're going to manage all of that. We're trying to take a very sort of sympathetic and empathetic approach to that, but we want to try and balance it with about a quarter of our people are new and have never met their colleagues or stepped foot in their Bays office, and trying to sort of get the thought going that you don't just attend an office for yourself, it's also for your colleagues and for your team, and trying to use the office for the collaboration and creativity, you know, learning and helping others to learn, and really taking advantage of what the kind of hybrid system has to offer, which I do think, if we get it right, will be a really great balance between being able to get a better work-life balance, but also spending time with colleagues. So quite a big focus for us on, you know, trying to, you know, move forward in a way that really works for people, really works for the business, and also enables us to manage much more effectively across locations, building people's careers, etc. too. But thank you, and really interesting to be part of the discussion this afternoon.
Great. I look forward to exploring some of that with you, because I think our experience of the current workplace for a lot of civil servants is hot desking and suboptimal, I'd say, workspace, and now obviously suboptimal because people are potentially always at home and not getting that balance and so on. So how we can again work through those elements to ensure a better workplace all over, and wherever that workplace is. But you know, that was really helpful. Thank you, Alice. So Kyle,
Yes,
please, your reflections on the survey, and also any other key points from your experience as at Leesman's and so on.
sure. Well, Peter and Alice said a whole lot there, which was really agree with all of that. And the stats that you guys showed, very comprehensive, covering loads of different aspects of what we're talking about. I guess I'll start off by saying the good news, or interestingly, you know, our data kind of aligns a lot to what you guys are getting out of the stats that you shared earlier. I'm talking from a wider perspective. We've got 170,000 responses on home working since in the last 12 months that we've been measuring various organizations around the world, including, as I said, around 26,000 civil servants is incorporated in that bigger number. Our data is focused on the workplace and the relationship between the employee and the workplace, and that's whether it be home office or third space or somewhere else. But yeah, just very quickly, what we're seeing over the last year is this great experiment that Peter was mentioning, the biggest one we've had ever, is with some surprising aspects initially where technology really held its own. That was some of the reasons that flexible or agile approaches were sort of not approved, as you mentioned earlier, concerns around various aspects in technology, but that really excelled from the beginning. Productivity has been soaring, or sense of productivity anyway. We don't measure productivity, but we do ask people to just say if their environment allows them to be productive, right? And as Alice touched on, we're seeing productivity in most of our organizations work with being really enabled through home working. So we compare, we look at the data in numerous different ways, but we look at the difference between collaborative and individual tasks, for example. And home working is outperforming. The average home is basically outperforming the average office in most cases, except for some aspects around collaboration and the obvious ones, having the physical presence of your colleagues, etc. But if you really think about it, it's quite crazy to say that an office that's designed for working is actually the average office is falling well short of a home which is not designed for working, right? So that just really points to how potentially poor some of the offices are out there that actually exist that are supposedly going to be attracting staff back to those locations, right? So there's a bit of a struggle now for employers to get people back, and of course, what we're talking about here. I'm in constant discussions with clients, and they're all grappling with this problem, right? It's very, very complex. It's not just a matter of making up some rules and off you go. That there's so many factors that need to be considered around this. Demographic groups we touched on. The learning development, knowledge transfer aspect of the younger employees that are out there, and not having exposure to to the more senior colleagues where they need to be getting that knowledge transfer off them. You mentioned a quarter of your organizations just joined in the last year. They're not getting that exposure, so we want to be bringing those guys back. But you also want to keep the benefits of what we're seeing home working providing, right? This agile approach. Work-life balance as well. I saw you had a few stats on there, and interestingly, our work-life balance percentage was almost exactly the same as what you had. And that's an interesting one as well, because we see, there's two sides of the coin, right? Some people actually need to go into the office to have that work-life balance, but having access or being able to work, from home a certain percentage of the week is also enhancing that, right? But if you get that wrong, it's actually showing up in a negative light, right? Where your work-life balance is not protected based on not being able to switch off and have the space available. So yeah, interested to carry on the discussion. I could talk for hours on this, but I'll stop there for now.
No, it's really interesting, because I think the Leesman report that I read that you did for the Government Property Agency really highlighted about the nature of occupancy of buildings and how that going forward is needing to change, because we get a lot of feedback. And in fact, on the survey, there was a load of feedback from people saying, the idea of the commute into the hot desking suboptimal office does not fill me with any desire. But at the same time saying, I feel there is the boundaries between work and home are completely out the window. So there is that, how we start to redress that balance is the crucial question, I think.
Yeah.
Victoria, have we got any questions that we've had in the Q&A that we could start our panel off with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just building on that point around that Carl mentioned about the way that we work and the research that you've done into like the different tasks that you do and which ones are more useful usefully done at home and which are more usefully done in the office. I think that's really interesting, and I think that will start to kind of shape how we design jobs in the future and how often they need to be in a workplace and how often they can be done from home. There's some great questions in here already. I'm going to throw two at you to start with, and I see Peter's put some thoughts in there already, so it'd be good to expand on those a little bit as well. I wanted to start with Stephanie's question, which says that we're really liking the focus on trust. Can panel members say if they see this emergency response being leveraged to support a cultural sea change to greater trust and respect across the board, that would be a godsend? I completely agree on a personal level. I think that would be really good, but do you think there's scope to leverage it, and how do you think that would be done? And then the second question is, if I do two, Lucille, then we can have a chat around that, if that's okay. Alan asked a really good question about how do you see job training developing with more home working? And there was another question around how we ensure L&D continues in a hybrid workforce, particularly for younger staff. I think that's a really interesting one, and it's one that we're actually grappling with as we start our first internship in a couple of weeks' time. And the way that we've had to structure that has been quite different as well, because we've had to probably invest more time in structuring something rather than just saying, oh, go and have a couple of hours over there or a couple of hours over here. You have to be more structured. But it'd be really interesting to get your views on that. So the first question was around that trust and what we can do to leverage a kind of a more promising, more kind of permanent change. And the second is just around L&D and how we kind of move that forward in this world as well.
Anyone want to start us off?
I was going to just touch on the trust point, and we started saying pretty early on that the trust has been forced upon organizations. They have to trust their employees to take your laptop and your mobile and off you go to do your work from home. And I think any organization that's going to try to reverse that and force employees to get back into the office, on a too much of a structured sort of approach, I think there's an element of risk there. We talk a lot about talent, finding talent and retaining staff, right? And how it's going to be a bit of a competition, I think, providing the right type of workplace, providing that trust as well, the flexibility for employees to be able to, they're going to be a bit more picky going forward, I think. So anyone who's getting too tough on that aspect, I think might run the risk of scaring off some of their own talent.
So Alice, so you obviously recruited a quarter of your staff during this period. So do you think you're going to hit that pitch?
So absolutely hoping so. So in terms of trust, so I think it really has enabled us to build trust with, particularly with ministers, that we can deliver very much in a different way. So early on in the pandemic, we got continual questions from some of the ministers across government about, are the civil service really working? We can't see them in Whitehall, so is anything really happening? And then they began to see really huge results from the amount of effort that people were putting in, and I'm not saying it was right, but the huge amount of excess hours people were working, and those kinds of things. And so I think there is, we want to sort of roll really with ministerial trust and trust in delivery across the civil service, and the trick's going to be to maintain that, because I think at a management level, part of the trust issue is about managers not feeling in control, isn't it? So when they can't see something, is it really happening? And I think the way that we've been working has been a lot more outcome focused. So certainly within Bays, we're going to be trying to look at ways to look at outcome rather than sort of monitor what people are doing hour by hour, that kind of thing. But I do think there's a huge opportunity, and I do think the pandemic's enabled us to get that moving in a way that we wouldn't have done before. Just the other thing on trust, though, I think the way that things happened last autumn with trying to get people back into offices too early did damage trust also, and we need to recognise that and to understand that and to approach what we're doing now on hybrid in a really sort of empathetic, supportive manner. And I think there is a recognition of that amongst the ministerial team, as well as in cabinet office and across departments as well. I thought that was worth mentioning, because I think that did have an impact, didn't it?
It did, and just the other thing I'd add, I'm going to agree with everything you said, Alice, as you said about this out of sight, out of mind, what I described as presenteeism. if we can make that cultural shift, we've made a big difference. And I think we can, but we've got to train managers to understand these things and what they take forwards. And we've got to get the tone from the top right. You know, the things you mentioned, we can't have all the bosses working from home and everybody else. All those sorts of dynamics would be part of trust as well. But the other thing I'd add is, which is why it's so important we learn as we go, because we've tended, and this speaks to not trusting, write tons of rules and policies. And that just says, actually, we don't really trust you. Here's all the rules by which you've now got to behave. And coming to one of the points about maybe write down France, when it was about this right to switch off. I don't know if you're familiar with the rule or law in France. It says you can't send emails up to certain times. So it's about finding this balance, isn't it? To trust our people to do the right thing, to empower them and give them that sense of autonomy, which is so much part of engagement, not bound them up with 100 rules, and learn, as I said, very much learn as we go. And I think that's another dynamic of our working cultures, which I think could change for the good.
Yeah, I mean, somebody who's been a trade unionist for nearly 30 years and experienced that sort of relationship with, we've ended up almost too rigid in the sort of policy direction, which obviously there needs to be principles and rules around in order to ensure inclusivity and you know, fair treatment. But equally, I think that balance has slipped to the employer side in that sense. Just on the second part of the other question is that do you have any suggestions on best practice to ensure learning and development continues in a hybrid workforce? I mean, my particular thoughts are around, particularly for managers, you know, we demand a lot of managers in the workplace in terms of HR policies and development, but also building up their teams, watching out for people, all of those things. And they always seem to be, the policy process always seems to be the last bit of the learning and development and assisting people to become the best manager or leader that they can be, just always seems to slightly slip off. And I'd be really interested if you've got any thoughts on that, you know, in terms of the future world of work and our learning from that experience and knowledge as well, but the particular one around a hybrid workforce and how you ensure that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say, Lucille, is your last point. It's been a soapbox of mine for many years that we have not trained managers well enough to manage people. We haven't evaluated and rewarded them on that enough. It's been so focused often on their technical job competence, and that's what gets you promotion and all those other things. A balance we need to redress. But yeah, on the wider learning and development point, there's a lot being talked about osmosis, which I find very interesting. I was talking to a journalist not long ago who said, well, I'd heard that everybody's office because it's all these water cooler moments and serendipitous connections, and they said, what did I think about that? And I said, to be honest, if your whole innovation strategy depends on that, you've got a far bigger problem than whether you're in the office or not. So I think sometimes it's a bit overplayed, but what we are learning is that of course there are aspects of osmosis, and to some degree you can replicate that virtually. I've seen teams that remain connected literally live all day and they're still working but talking to each other when they need to. But it is forcing us to think harder about how we really do learning and what we've got to learn, and certainly an acceleration of digital learning and remote learning, which, you know, collectively we've fallen behind on in terms of practice and application. So I think this will also, I think, cause much more of a, in many ways, a reinvention of learning and development. And I'm not denying osmosis, but I think sometimes it's a little overplayed for what we're talking about here.
So I think certainly for new people, so going back to our sort of quarter of the workforce that have never met their colleagues, I think they have missed out on, you know, the induction into, you know, things like the, you know, what's it actually like to work around here, the cultural aspects that are quite difficult to train online, and I think that's the big thing that we've missed out on. I agree with you, Peter, on, you know, the digital learning and the fact that the water cooler moments are sometimes overplayed when we're making a case for people to return to the office. So I do think with hybrid there's an opportunity to get the best of both, really, to make sure that there are moments for teams to come together, for new people to start to feel like the part of the fabric of an organisation, but also to think a bit more about learning more generally. So I think, you know, there is still a tendency to think about courses when actually working in this way does open up far more informal learning. So I said earlier about people being able to attend meetings that they wouldn't normally have been able to go to do more shadowing, to attend executive committee discussions, all of those kinds of things, whereas if you were face to face it would be more constrained. Actually it opens up the opportunities for those kinds of informal learning. So I think it will be the need to kind of blend that, to think about it and to make sure that we've got the right learning for the right kind of skills and knowledge development will be where we need to hit the sweet spot. We haven't got it sussed yet. So again, I think the old test and learn mantra is where we need to go with that as we move back into a hybrid way of working.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, actually. Kyle, did you have anything on the learning and development?
Not too much to add, really. I'd slightly disagree with the water cooler moment sort of and learning by osmosis aspect. I think that can be underestimated, the impact that has. I think we're tending to be more siloed in by the way of so many structured meetings, etc. I mean, we're only a small organization, in comparison, but when just the time that we've been back in the office together as a team and having those creative sessions or just being around each other, cross departmentally, has just got huge benefits. And I talked about the generation aspects as well, but keep an eye on those younger generations. I think is so key that they have, they just see how their colleagues behave and interact, and it's a lot of subtle things that you don't get through Zoom, which I think we've got to keep an eye on. But I agree with what Alice said as well. Like you have much more exposure, right? I mean, it's kind of leveled the playing field to some degree, where you'd be sitting in front of a CEO where you wouldn't normally have that FaceTime with them necessarily, and you're just having a conversation in their living room and your kitchen table, right? So that's kind of cool, because it gives a like I said, a bit more level playing field. But finding that balance, sure, I think once that balance can be struck, then you're going to get the benefits of both of those worlds.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think it isn't all or nothing, is it, in that sense, and that therefore trying to, I suppose, recalibrate the processes in that sense, I think is something that we should all aim to try and take through this process. Victoria, have we do you want to add anything else in terms of learning and development, and also any other top questions?
Yeah, of course. I think Carl, your point's really interesting there, because I think there's maybe a bit of a balance between the opportunity now to recruit more from a more diverse pool, which we know, particularly if we're looking from the civil service perspective, places for growth, is if that's going to take off in the way we think it will, but also the accessibility issue. I think that could potentially really open up the demographics for the civil service. But then do you have to offset that with, as you said, that balance of, if we're all working in a more isolated way, how do you make sure you're making the most of those kind of lived experiences? I think that's really relevant in the civil service context. I think from L&D side, we run a Women into Leadership and BAE Men's Leadership conferences, and we've really had to think about how we deliver those. So I don't know about you, but a day of Zoom meetings is, no disrespect to our Zoom colleague on the line, but is a bit too much. So we've really had to think about how do you chunk that up and how do you break the content down. And actually, I think that helps some people to digest the information, to take a bit of time to think about what you've just done, rather than just bouncing from session to session. So hopefully you'll see that in our ADC and all the events we've got on this week as well. There are some really great questions, and I think we're going to struggle to get through all of them. Nicola asked a really good question just around opportunities for collaboration. And I think, Alice, you actually hit the nail on the head with some of your suggestions from the conversation we've already been having. I'll pick on two others. One was from Margaret, who has highlighted that this week is Mental Health Awareness Week, and there's a particular focus on nature. What one thing would you do to incorporate more nature into working lives to improve mental health? I think it's a really, really good question. And the other one I was going to highlight was from Helen. Again, trying to think of the more practical tips we can take away from this session, perhaps. But what does the panel see as the best way to include virtual participants in meetings where some attendees are able to be together? Is good sharing the skills key to that? I think that's really interesting, because I think, Lucille, you and I were having a conversation about this back in the office, so goodness knows when that was, about some steps in DFE where they were moving their senior management team onto virtual only platforms. So people were sitting in the office on Teams calls or on video calls or teleconferences. And we thought, I remember sitting there with Lucille and thinking, this is a bit of a strange way of operating. But I wonder, yeah, have you got any other suggestions about what might be some good ways of making sure that all attendees can participate?
I was really struck by the Leesman's report, Kyle, around within the civil service, both the complexity of roles and how that affects people, but also in terms of thinking around mental health awareness, the quality of your home environment versus an office environment, and what drives some of those desires to go back into an office, i.e. if you're working out of your bedroom in a shared house, you know, there's a very different experience for somebody who's got, you know, the luck or the privilege of having their own room to set up as an office and so on. I don't know if you wanted to come in on that aspect at all.
Yeah, I mean, when we've studied our home working data, the number one driver of experience at home is this work setting, right? It's kind of obvious, but we can, you know, prove that it's got a huge impact. And we have a sort of three choices: a private office or work setting, and then a work setting but in a shared environment, and then the worst kind, let's say, or the least favored, which would be working from a sofa or dining room table, for example. And when we looked at those through those different lenses, it's quite interesting how much it impacts productivity, obviously, but things like collaboration and even work-life balance, right? So you know, you may just think about it as doing your work, but actually it's having a much wider impact, a ripple effect across, you know, we're talking about well-being aspects for sure, definitely. And, you know, that's going to be a motivator to want to be coming back into the office or not as well. And how best, I don't know, I'm sort of answering the second question because it's quite an interesting one, but we see acoustic privacy as the biggest challenge going forward within offices, right? At home, acoustic privacy is just like performing brilliantly, right? Because most of us have the ability to just have a call and you don't have the distractions around you. And even going back into the office recently, that's just, even in a small organization like ours, it's so problematic because you're sitting in a space where you want to be talking, but someone's calling each other, and, you know, the dynamic of that is just not going to work. And if we explode that into bigger organizations, it's going to be pretty tough out there. So the workplace is going to have to really adjust and work a lot harder to accommodate those types of conversations. And I saw a really interesting little movie this week where Google is doing some experimentation on setting up really cool technology to improve and just, I guess, level that ability to have remote and in-present meetings. And that, you know, obviously they have a bigger budget than most to be spending on that, but they were talking about how some of this can translate into relatively affordable options. So I think there's going to be a huge shift over the coming months of tech, you know, driving that, behaviors driving that, like we just touched on just now. Really, we need to organize our diaries better. We can't just have Zoom calls all day. Organizations have to find logical ways and ways that are, you know, not too rigid, where we can adapt these better working behaviors to be able to deal with this.
Alice or Peter, have you got any thoughts in terms of either the Mental Health Awareness Week and well-being, and your experiences or observations of how people have fared during this process, but also going forward, how you can factor in those elements of well-being, which is going to be much more of a focus, I think.
So we've been through in Bays quite an intensive period over the last couple of years, because we've been one of the departments that's been involved in exiting the EU, and then obviously one of the key departments for dealing with COVID. So we've had quite a lot of, we've had to pivot at very, very short notice, move people around the organisation. So we moved 1,800 people onto COVID over a period of about 3 weeks. So significant periods of change and pressure, which have affected people's mental health quite significantly. So we've actually taken the step in Bays of making wellbeing is one of our key departmental level strategic risks. and therefore we've been able to put quite a lot of activity in place to try and support people. So it is, I mean, it's something that we take really seriously. I don't think we've cracked it yet, of course we haven't, but we have got to a place where we've got managers talking about it, thinking about resource allocation properly, prioritisation properly, all of those things that go towards helping. And we've done quite a lot of hopefully quite creative things within teams as well. So making sure people do get outside, so the link with nature, making sure people do get outside in daylight hours for a walk, or just outside, outside their four walls, has been, I think, quite important. 2 sessions that we've had of people kind of cooking churros online with their teams, so quite a lot of really quite creative ideas. But that also tries to build the sense of community, and the fact that people, particularly who live alone, need a bit of that as well. So we've tried to do a fair bit on that, but I definitely think that getting outside message is one that's stuck, and that most people are trying to at least do that at some point of the day. I think that's been really, really important for people.
Yeah, and I echo that, Alice. I've seen many organisations. I mean, the whole well-being thing, as I said, I think has really been amplified through the pandemic, and I think any self-respecting organisation has prioritised this much more. And as you said, trying to talk to people much more, understanding where the stresses are, support them better. Give many organisations, including the CIPD, we said, look, you're all going to have an period, right? We just want you to get some time during the day when you go do something different. And although we talk a lot about Teams calls, let's not forget we can also meet by phone. And sometimes we say it doesn't always have to be a Zoom call. You can also call people and have a conference call, and you can sit in the park when you do it. Or indeed, as things open up, people are saying, well, do I have to come into the office, or could I just work from Starbucks or somewhere else? And that's true remote working. It's all these different forms. So I think there are many things like that. But I agree with the comment, which is about access to nature has been shown to help our mental health and well-being. So let's, for heaven's sake, continue these ideas. But just some other quick thoughts on the whole working practices stuff. I mean, I think there is an awful lot, as we're all saying, there's a lot to learn. I think how we work with virtual and remote people together in a meeting. Somebody commented we're going to have to train chairs and make sure we understand how to do that. I agree with Carl's points on technology, but interestingly, technology like this has been around for a very long time. I mean, I remember back in the noughties working in very virtual environments, which, okay, it was fairly high end then, but it's now much more accessible, where you could virtually not tell whether the person was in the room or not. I mean, you all sat around a table, half the people were virtual and half weren't. So there's going to be technology investments in this. But I think fundamentally it is forcing us to think a lot more about what we actually do at work and why we're in our workplaces. And it ranges all the way from social connection and contact to the cultural dynamics we talked about. But honestly, I mean, I've been into so many offices for so many years, and you walk into offices and everybody's sat in front of a screen, typing things, emailing colleagues 2 desks away. And now we're going to say, look, actually, when we come into the office, let's reinforce that idea of social connection. Let's think about learning differently, which is why I do want to challenge a little bit on this osmosis thing. I'm not denying osmosis, but let's not use that as the excuse as why everybody's got to be back in the office, because that's the only way we learn. Now let's think about what we're learning and think about the ways in which we can help and support that learning in these hybrid ways. So this is probably the biggest question of all, is really thinking about our working practices, really thinking about how we're using workspace differently to enable these different ways, which are good for well-being, good for connection, good for inclusion, and everything else. And that's exciting. But as I said in my opening remarks, this is going to be harder than the original lockdown, and which is why, as Alice has kept saying, and I profoundly believe too, we have got to test and learn. We have to learn as we go, see what works. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. But engage our people throughout those processes. It's not about us as managers telling everybody what it's going to be like. We've got to engage with our people throughout this process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I suppose just in terms of, we've got a minute left, so I'm going to give you a quick fire round just to pull us together in terms of what do you think on your #1 opportunity would be for future world of work, and your #1 risk going forward. And I'll start with Alice, please.
Thank you. So I think my number one opportunity is the real possibility of making sustained change in how we work, and not feeling that we have to make that daily commute forevermore every single day of the week. I think that's got to be the biggest opportunity, and the risk really is the pivot of that. So the risk that we will all end up working all of the time that we would have spent on the commute, as well as the days in the day, and don't have separation between work and home. We absolutely need to solve that for people too. Thanks, Lucille.
Thanks. Kyle?
Only one each. I think I'll go for risk first. I think that the biggest risk is, I think someone mentioned earlier, like a tier 2 sort of structure where people, you know, an inclusivity factor. I think we need to consider in the next few months how we transition to that future state, for sure. I mean, the opportunity, I mean, in a nutshell, we can create a much better workplace experience for everyone if we can find that balance. You know, that's the opportunity. Obviously, that's a complex wish, but yes, that's what we can do.
Brilliant. And Peter, finally.
Yeah, I think I'd echo the same thoughts. This ultimately, to me, is about better working opportunities for all, so inclusion, absolutely fundamental to this. But the risk is that we don't understand all these dynamics, and therefore we get inequality growing. And that I think is the exact flip side of the opportunity of inclusion.
Fantastic. I'm badly chairing, so finally, I mean, it's been a brilliant start to the conversation. I really hope that you'll come on this journey with us, and we'll keep you in touch and keep you involved in these discussions and develop them as we go along, as we've tested and learnt. But thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for the participants giving us testing questions, and we'll hopefully see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.